The camera's red light blinked to life. Across millions of television screens, the feed cut to a wide shot of the auditorium. Sleek, modern, and eerily still. Rows of spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, yet the silence was suffocating. You could hear a pen click, a throat clear. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed too loud, but all eyes were drawn to the center stage, where two podiums stood like opposing altars. On the left, Candace Owens, dressed in bold white, expression unreadable, a calm sharpened by years of calculated controversy. On the right, Jasmine Crockett, navy blue suit, straight shoulders, lips pressed into a line so tight it could have cut glass. She wasn't just standing there. She was bracing for something. The producers had billed this as an honest dialogue on race in America. But Jasmine knew better. It wasn't a dialogue, it was a test, a trap. The kind where you're expected to stay composed while someone rewrites your pain in real time. She'd been warned. The emails had come in waves. Watch yourself. They'll bait you. Don't let her rattle you. But none of those voices were with her now. Just her breath, steady but coiled. A soft ding signaled the countdown. 5 seconds to live broadcast. The moderator smiled like nothing dangerous was about to unfold. But Jasmine saw the glint in Owens's eye. The kind of glint that comes from knowing you'll be given a microphone and full permission to gaslight a nation. Jasmine had been here before. Not this exact stage, but countless ones like it. Courtrooms where she was the only black woman in the room. Legislative floors where voices like hers were treated as noise, not evidence. Every time she spoke truth, she was told it was too emotional, too extreme, too much. But now, she was done shrinking. And still, she felt the chill, not from fear, but from recognition, that before anything is said, the air always changes, like a storm hovering just above the roofline. You don't see it, but your skin feels it. The weight, the pressure, the tension in the atoms. That was this moment. A producer gestured quietly from the wings. Live in 3, 2, 1. The screen faded into a close-up of Jasmine's face, poised, unreadable, yet undeniably present. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every mother who buried a son no camera ever filmed. Every man who sat in prison for a crime his skin had committed. Every girl told to stay quiet because no one's going to believe you anyway. Then came the first line, not from Jasmine, from Owens, cold, crisp. Systemic racism, it's a myth we tell ourselves to excuse failure. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Gasps fluttered through the audience. The moderator blinked, already off balance. Owens pressed forward, smooth as ice. Black Lives Matter isn't a movement. It's a marketing scheme. A way to sell rage and keep us angry enough not to move on. The silence snapped, not into applause, not into boos, but into something worse, uncertainty. And Jasmine felt it deep in her spine, that familiar twist, that injustice that isn't loud or theatrical, but quiet, surgical, the kind that slices at the soul while smiling for the camera. She didn't flinch, but inside her history, her people's history, burned. Owens had weaponized her platform to recode trauma as delusion, and Jasmine wasn't about to let her finish the rewrite. She looked straight ahead, not at Owens, not at the crowd, but into the lens, as if to say, "You don't get to tell our story without the truth sitting across from you." She tightened her grip on the podium. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun, and she was ready. The moment Candace Owens leaned into the microphone, her voice cut through the auditorium like a blade cloaked in silk. "Let's stop pretending," she began, her tone measured, almost maternal. "Black Americans aren't oppressed. They're misled. Misled by false prophets who sell victimhood for profit." There it was, the first strike, delivered not as an explosion, but as a slow-acting poison, the kind that numbs before it kills. She spoke with chilling clarity, her smile calm, her cadence deliberate. "Movements like Black Lives Matter aren't about justice," she continued. "They're about chaos. They've burned cities, destroyed families, and made black pain a subscription model." The audience tensed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded, drawn in by her certainty. But Jasmine? She didn't move. She'd heard this script before. It was familiar, rehearsed, perfected in boardrooms where race was a talking point, not a lived experience. Owens wasn't debating. She was indicting an entire community with the arrogance of someone who'd never carried its burden. Jasmine's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from precision. She had spent years listening to that same narrative dressed in different suits. Judges in courtrooms who told her that a black teen looked like trouble. Landlords who claimed it wasn't personal when denying leases in black neighborhoods. Senators who called for unity after voting against justice. Owens was just the latest mask worn by an old machine. The machinery of denial, polished, televised, and rebranded as reason. But Jasmine knew what lurked beneath the veneer: fear of truth. And truth was something she carried like armor. Owens wasn't finished. "If you really care about black lives," she snapped, "then talk about crime rates. Talk about fatherlessness. Talk about the choices we make." She emphasized "we" like a badge of authenticity, as if skin alone granted her the moral license to dismiss generations of systemic rot. Jasmine's jaw clenched. She had defended clients whose fathers were gone not by choice, but by incarceration quotas. She had watched grandmothers beg for their sons' freedom, only to be told the system was working as intended. The cruelty wasn't in Owens's words. It was in their calm delivery, their plausible tone, lies coded in logic. The moderator cleared his throat but offered no redirection. This was the playbook. Let the outrage fester and let the spectacle draw ratings. Jasmine's fingers curled slightly against the podium edge. Not from emotion, but restraint. If she snapped now, they'd call her angry. If she showed pain, they'd call her weak. She had no room to breathe, only space to speak. And that space was vanishing with every unchecked syllable pouring from Owens's mouth. Then came the low blow. "You know what no one wants to say?" Owens asked, gaze sweeping across the room like a predator reading its prey. "We've become addicted to our own oppression stories. It gives us attention, it gives us cover, and that's the real disease. Narratives of helplessness." The room stilled. That wasn't just a strike, it was a desecration. She wasn't debating facts. She was erasing trauma, rewriting history with a smile. Jasmine stared straight ahead. Her mind flashed to names: George, Brianna, Elijah, Sandra, not hashtags, people. Each syllable Owens spoke felt like another nail in the coffin of collective memory. But something shifted then, not in Jasmine, but around her. The air grew denser. The audience leaned in. Something in them recognized the cruelty beneath the polish. And Jasmine, still silent, became the center of gravity. She wasn't just a participant anymore. She was the reckoning that was about to arrive. Because when truth is denied, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer waiting. The answer would come next. It started with a smirk, just the faintest curl at the corner of Candace Owens' lips. Sharp, smug, controlled. The kind of expression someone wears when they believe they've already won. She leaned into the microphone, voice steady as a scalpel. "Let's be honest," she said. "The only thing more profitable than victimhood in America is pretending to fight it." Her eyes flicked sideways, straight toward Jasmine Crockett. The air snapped. You could almost hear it, the collective gasp that never quite left the audience's throats. Jasmine didn't blink. But inside, something detonated. Not rage, not disbelief. Something quieter, deeper, like the click of a lock turning just before a storm door blows open. Owens continued, her tone calculated, her timing surgical. "You talk about systemic racism like it's air, like it's everywhere, invisible but lethal. But where's the proof? Is it in the neighborhoods we destroy ourselves? Is it in the opportunities we're too lazy to take? Or maybe..." She paused, perfectly, cruelly. "Maybe it's just a story we tell to avoid facing the truth about who we become." That was it. That was the line. The one that broke the room, cracked it in two, and left the truth gasping in the middle. Some audience members shifted forward, eager to lap up the spectacle. Others shrank back, visibly disturbed, but paralyzed by the shock. The moderator looked down at his notes as if reading could excuse his silence. But Jasmine, she didn't move an inch, because she had heard this before. Just not this loud, not this televised, not this openly cruel. Owens wasn't just challenging the system, she was mocking the wounds it left behind. Jasmine's mind swirled, not in chaos but in clarity. She saw her father's hands after a 12-hour shift when no one would rent him a home because his credit was flagged. She remembered the trembling voice of her first client, a 17-year-old arrested for loitering outside a library because he looked suspicious. She thought of the mother who had to choose between court fees and insulin. None of those people had cameras. None of them had platforms. But Owens? She had both, and she used them not to elevate, but to erase. The camera panned in. A close-up of Jasmine Crockett's face filled the screen. No rage, no fear, just focus. Glacial, grounded, unstoppable. She took one breath and another. Then she stepped forward. Not a movement of anger, but of absolute certainty. The moderator finally glanced up, sensing the shift too late. Jasmine's voice when it came wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that carried because it was carrying the weight of something sacred. "Candace," she said, steady as steel, "you just spit on the graves of every black man who died screaming for breath. You didn't speak the truth. You performed a eulogy for justice, and you laughed while you read it." The room didn't explode. It sank into a silence so dense it pressed against the lungs. The audience stopped breathing. The cameras didn't dare cut. Jasmine didn't pause. This isn't about disagreement. This is about denial. You took the pain of millions and turned it into a punchline. You didn't debate the facts. You desecrated the dead. And then, without raising her voice, she delivered the blow that would ring beyond the room. You don't need chains to be a tool of oppression. Sometimes all it takes is a mic, a platform, and a smile. Owens didn't respond. Couldn't. Because in that moment it was clear the storm she thought she'd conjured had shifted. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just standing on that stage. She was standing on every unmarked grave that history tried to bury, and she was making sure this time the world wouldn't look away. The reckoning had begun. Before the cameras, before the firestorms of controversy, before the televised implosions and viral hashtags, there was just Candace. Candace Owens. A name that for years sparked either thunderous applause or stunned silence, depending on which side of the aisle you stood on. Her rise was no accident. It was engineered, built brick by brick through carefully chosen battles and surgically targeted outrage. She didn't come to power in spite of conflict. She climbed her way up by weaponizing it. Her early days were filled with contradictions. A bright student from Stamford, Connecticut, Owens once filed a racial discrimination lawsuit against her school board. Back then, she was a teenager who feared for her safety after being targeted in a hate-filled voicemail. That Candace, the one who spoke softly about injustice, vanished in the rearview mirror. What emerged from that legal victory wasn't a victim seeking healing. It was a tactician who just discovered the power of narrative and how easily it could be flipped. Years later, she reemerged online with a brand new voice and a sharper edge. Gone was the talk of trauma. In its place, a different song entirely. Systemic racism isn't real. Black Americans are their own worst enemy. Victimhood is the new currency. It wasn't just controversial, it was explosive. And people listened. Not because she was saying what they believed, but because she was giving them permission to believe it out loud. She became the perfect storm, a black woman telling white America that racism wasn't their fault. It was a message custom-tailored for headlines and for immunity. She was invited onto every major conservative stage. CPA, see Fox News, Turning Point USA. Each appearance sharpened her blade. She learned how to dismantle opposing arguments, not with facts, but with fire. Owens didn't debate. She dominated. She mocked. She smirked. She made righteousness look like weakness. She didn't seek conversation. She demanded submission. Her fans adored her. Critics feared her. And in Washington, even those who despised her watched carefully. Because Candace Owens didn't just walk into the arena, she set the floor on fire. But power built on provocation is never stable. And as her platform grew, so did the shadows trailing behind her. The more she denied racism, the more viral her clips became. The more she mocked the oppressed, the more corporate sponsors lined up. But beneath the surface, cracks formed. People started to notice how she never spoke to survivors, only about them. How she never visited the neighborhoods she criticized. How her brand was outrage, but her product was silence. Silencing history, silencing truth, silencing pain. And yet her influence continued to swell. Why? Because she served a system hungry for absolution, a country exhausted by accountability. Candace gave them both. In place of hard truths, she offered performance. In place of justice, she offered comfort. She told America what it wanted to hear, that the past was over, the present was fair, and the only people keeping racism alive were the ones still talking about it. Jasmine Crockett saw through it from the very beginning. To her, Owens wasn't a trailblazer. She was a mirage, one carefully crafted to distract, to distort, a weapon disguised as representation. And now they stood on opposite ends of a stage, the weight of centuries between them. Owens, polished and poised, wielded her words like scalpel strikes. But Jasmine had come armed with something far more dangerous. Truth. And as Candace delivered her next line, one she'd probably rehearsed in the mirror a dozen times, she had no idea that the storm she thought she controlled was already slipping through her fingers. Because there's one thing even the sharpest tongue can't cut through: history that refuses to stay buried. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise through the ranks with camera lights and curated soundbites. She rose through the noise, through courtrooms that stank of mildew and injustice, through neighborhoods where gunshots were more common than school buses, through whispers in the halls of power that said women like her didn't belong, not because of her education, not because of her record, but because of her skin. Jasmine wasn't polished, she was forged, burned hot in the fire of real lives, real pain, and real silence. And if Candace Owens built a career telling America it could ignore the wound, Jasmine was the scalpel determined to expose it. She didn't come from money. She didn't come from privilege. She came from a line of women who didn't have the luxury of outrage because they were too busy surviving. Her mother worked 3 jobs and still came home with holes in her shoes. Her father taught her how to hold her head high, even when the world made her feel 2 inches tall. Jasmine didn't need to read about injustice in a textbook. She lived it. She carried it. And when she stepped into courtrooms as a public defender, she brought all of that with her: the anger, the dignity, the unrelenting fire. She remembered one case like it was still breathing: a 16-year-old boy, rail thin and shaking, arrested for stealing diapers. Not drugs, not weapons, diapers. His sister had a newborn and no way to afford them. The DA wanted 6 months. Jasmine wanted a revolution. She stood in front of the judge with a trembling voice and steel in her spine. "What's the cost of compassion?" she asked. "Because if this boy pays with 6 months of his life, this court just sold justice at a discount." The charges were dropped, but the shame in the boy's eyes never left her. That was the day she decided defending wasn't enough. She needed to rewrite the law itself. But politics was a different kind of beast, and the halls of Congress were colder than any courtroom. People smiled to her face and sabotaged her behind closed doors. Committees forgot to invite her. Bills were buried without explanation, and every time she spoke up, the same condescending whispers followed her down the hallway. Too passionate, too emotional, too much. But Jasmine had long since learned how to weaponize too much. She used it like a battering ram against every locked door in Washington. Her voice wasn't crafted by consultants. It was carved by necessity. She didn't speak in slogans. She spoke in scars, in the names of people who never made it to the news, in the tremors left behind by mothers who screamed over caskets while the system took notes. She didn't need to be the loudest. She just needed to be the one who never looked away. And when she challenged legislation, it wasn't from theory, it was from memory. She remembered the faces, the files, the bruises hidden under long sleeves. Her colleagues brought talking points. Jasmine brought ghosts. So when the opportunity came to face Owens, she didn't flinch. She didn't prep for sound bites. She prepped for war. Not the kind fought with fists, but with memory, with truth, with a fire that had never been extinguished, only waiting for oxygen. And as the spotlight bore down on her, Jasmine didn't see cameras. She saw the courtroom benches filled with the broken and forgotten. She saw the chain-link fences of underfunded schools. She saw America as it really was, and refused to let the illusion win. Because for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't a debate. This was the battlefield she'd been walking toward her entire life. There was no applause, no music, no fanfare. Just two women standing on opposite ends of a stage, breathing the same air but speaking from entirely different worlds. The distance between Jasmine Crockett and Candace Owens wasn't measured in steps. It was measured in bloodlines, in betrayals, in the unspoken violence of history itself. And as their eyes locked under the glare of studio lights, what unfolded wasn't a clash of opinions. It was a collision of philosophies, each forged in fire, each ready to burn the other down. Candace believed in the bootstraps gospel. That pain was personal, that suffering was self-made, that racism was a convenient excuse for those unwilling to evolve. To her, Black Americans didn't need systemic change. They needed better habits. Her words dripped with the certainty of someone who had never had to beg a system for breath. Her worldview wasn't built on lived experience. It was built on optics. Neatly packaged, tightly controlled, and sold to an audience desperate to believe that the past was just a story. She weaponized accountability like a shield. Every statistic she cited came without context, every indictment cloaked in logic but bleeding with contempt. Candace didn't deny history, she edited it. Jasmine, on the other hand, didn't have the luxury of abstraction. Her philosophy was born in courtrooms and in kitchens, where families argued over which bill to pay first. She didn't talk about oppression as theory. She talked about it as oxygen, omnipresent, suffocating, invisible until it's gone. Her truth wasn't polished. It was raw, jagged, and carried the scent of sweat and survival. She believed in responsibility, yes, but she also knew what it meant to be locked out before you even got the chance to try. For her, justice wasn't just about fixing laws. It was about restoring dignity, about telling the truth so loud, even silence couldn't survive it. And now those two truths stood across from each other, unmoving. Candace spoke with the confidence of someone who had never felt a door close without reason. Jasmine stood with the weariness of someone who had kicked down every one of those doors herself. One preached the power of the individual. The other warned of the weight of the system. One demanded obedience. The other demanded recognition. It wasn't just ideological, it was spiritual. Because what Candace represented wasn't just denial, it was seduction. The promise that if you played by the rules, you could rise. That if you smiled wide enough and stayed quiet long enough, you might get a seat at the table. Jasmine had seen that table. She knew it was built on bones. She knew that acceptance often came with the price tag of erasure. As Owens rattled off economic stats and deflection tactics, Jasmine didn't interrupt. She listened, not because she agreed, but because she understood the game. Candace wasn't speaking to her, she was speaking over her, to the audience, to the donors, to the headlines waiting to be clipped. But Jasmine wasn't here to perform, she was here to reveal. And revelations don't come with applause, they come with aftermath. So when her turn came, she didn't argue the numbers. She unmasked the intent. She exposed the rot hiding beneath the rhetoric. You want to talk about choices, she said, her voice steady, but never about who gets them. You want to talk about crime, but never about the conditions that create it. You want to talk about freedom, but only for those who already have it. Each word landed like a gavel, not shouted, delivered. Because this fight wasn't about proving who was right. It was about refusing to let the wrong go unanswered. And Jasmine Crockett didn't come to win an argument. She came to make sure no one watching would ever look at injustice the same way again. The silence was volcanic, the kind that simmers waiting to erupt. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, her hand resting on the podium not for balance, but for control. Across from her, Candace Owens wore that same polished smirk, the kind crafted in media green rooms and hardened in echo chambers. But Jasmine didn't look at her. Not directly, Not yet. Her eyes scanned the room, then locked onto the lens, the one that would carry her voice into living rooms, courtrooms, classrooms. If Owens had just delivered a monologue of dismissal, Jasmine was about to drop the kind of truth that couldn't be edited out. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It slid beneath the skin like heat, slow, searing, inescapable. "Let me be clear," she began, every syllable deliberate, her breath measured like a heartbeat before battle. "What you just said wasn't political commentary. It was an obituary. You stood here and declared that the pain of my people is manufactured. You looked into this camera and told the world that the chains we still feel are our own imagination." The audience shifted, eyes wide, some mouths slightly open, not from shock, but from recognition. Crockett wasn't just answering an opponent. She was excavating centuries of silence in real time. "You want to talk about broken homes?" she continued, her gaze now boring directly into Owens. "Then let's talk about who broke them. Let's talk about redlining. Let's talk about drug laws written in back rooms that turned entire black neighborhoods into hunting grounds. You want to talk about crime? Then let's talk about poverty that was manufactured, schools that were defunded, fathers taken by mandatory minimums for crimes the wealthy don't even get charged with. You want to talk about personal responsibility? Then tell me, when does the system take any?" Every line landed like a strike of lightning, jagged and bright, tearing through the false calm that had settled over the auditorium. But she wasn't done. Jasmine's voice dropped an octave, slower, colder. "I've held children who watched their parents die from bullets meant for someone else. I've sat across from mothers who lost sons to a justice system that saw a hoodie as intent. I've seen men cry not because they were guilty, but because they knew innocence wouldn't save them." She paused, letting the silence breathe for a second, then stepped forward, the stage lights catching a glint in her eyes. Not tears, but steel. "And you take all of that, and you call it a lie." Owen's expression faltered, just slightly. A blink, a twitch, a crack in the armor. Jasmine leaned into it. "You talk about Black America like it's a brand you can discard. But we are not a campaign. We are not a debate prop. We are not your punchline. We are the descendants of people who bled in chains so you could stand here in designer heels and call their struggle optional." The room held its breath. Crockett's tone sharpened. "You stand on the bones of giants and accuse them of being too loud in their pain." Then came the moment, the kind no script can prepare for. Crockett placed her hands on either side of the podium and spoke with a clarity that cut through everything. "I did not come here to win a debate. I came here because truth doesn't defend itself. I came here because my silence costs lives, and I won't pay that price to keep anyone comfortable. Not anymore." The crowd didn't erupt. Not yet. They were still in it, still processing the weight of everything she'd just delivered. But the shift was unmistakable. The air had changed. The fire had started. And for the first time in that auditorium, Candace Owens looked like someone who understood. This wasn't just a battle of words. This was a reckoning. It happened without warning. 1 second, the auditorium buzzed with the weight of Crockett's words. Heavy, electric, undeniable. And the next, the lights dimmed just slightly, and a soft mechanical hum filled the silence. All eyes turned to the large screen positioned behind the podiums. Nobody had cued a video. Not officially. But someone, somewhere, had been waiting for this exact moment. Then it began to play. The footage was grainy, dated. A conference stage. A banner in the background read, "Turning Point USA, 2018 National Summit." At the center of the frame, a younger Candace Owens stood confidently, microphone in hand, delivering her trademark monologue with the swagger of someone utterly convinced they were untouchable. Her voice rang out, crisp and clear despite the recording's age. "What we need is nationalism. Real, unapologetic nationalism. You know, Hitler was a nationalist and, if we're being honest, his methods were just misunderstood." The auditorium froze. Not a single movement, no cough, no shift, just a paralyzing, breathless silence that stretched across the room like a wire pulled too tight. Time itself felt suspended. Jasmine didn't move, not out of shock, but because she didn't need to. The video was speaking louder than any retort ever could. Candace's voice, confident, unflinching, filled the chamber with a cold, historical echo that shattered the illusion she had so carefully curated. On screen, Owens continued, "Nationalism isn't a bad thing. It's only been weaponized by the left. People hear Hitler and forget the context." The audience in the old video laughed. The audience in the room tonight did not. They were locked in place, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the air. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not in surprise. She had heard the rumors before, but in realization. This was no longer a debate. It was an unmasking. Candace Owens stood frozen beside her podium, her face drained of its practiced poise, eyes fixed on the screen like she had just witnessed her own undoing in real time. She didn't flinch, but the tremor was there, in her jaw, in her hands, in the sharp inhale that betrayed everything her body was trying not to reveal. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a confession on tape, the kind no PR spin could rewrite, and the audience knew it. The murmurs started slowly, like the distant rumble of thunder. Then came the whispers, gasps, turned heads, exchanged glances, a storm swelling in silence. Phones rose instinctively, capturing not just the screen, but the face of the woman who had built an empire on denial, now caught in the floodlight of her own words. Jasmine didn't say a thing. She didn't need to. Truth had just walked into the room and sat at every table. The moderator looked panicked, flipping through his cue cards like they could save him from what had just occurred. But there was no script for this, no recovery. The line had been crossed, not in rhetoric, but in history. To invoke Hitler and call his methods misunderstood wasn't just a bad take. It was a moral fracture, a glimpse into a darkness too many had fought too hard to bury. Owens hadn't simply disrespected a movement. She had stepped into the shadow of genocide and tried to normalize it. Jasmine finally turned to her. Slow, controlled, devastating. "You want to talk about context?" she said, her voice low but thunderous. "There is no context in which praising Hitler is acceptable. None. You didn't misspeak. You revealed yourself." And with that, the balance shifted. Not just in the room, but across the country. The video was already online, already viral, already shattering the echo chambers that had once protected Owen's voice. But inside that chamber, in that moment, it wasn't a clip or a scandal. It was the truth, unedited, and it had just taken the floor. It didn't implode with screaming. It unraveled in silence. A silence so sharp, so unnatural, it sliced through the room like glass. Candace Owens stood beneath the flickering spotlight, a woman suddenly dwarfed by the scale of her own echo. Her breath shallowed. Her fingers twitched at the podium. But the expression on her face, once so assured, so bulletproof, now cracked, faltered. This wasn't embarrassment. This was realization. That the carefully engineered machine of her persona had just encountered a fault line too deep to patch. And everyone was watching the quake. The video still lingered on the screen, paused at the exact moment her lips shaped the word Hitler. Frozen in history, unblinking, brutal. Phones recorded everything, not for memory, but for evidence, for receipts. The audience had morphed into something else now, not just spectators, but witnesses. Some stared with horror, others with vindication, many with disbelief. But no one, absolutely no one, looked away. This was no longer a debate stage. It was a courtroom without walls, and the gavel had already struck. The moderator tried to speak, lips parting with a stammer, but no words came. What could he say? How do you pivot from a nationalist defense of a dictator into commercial break? How do you neutralize something so morally radioactive it glows in the dark? You don't. So he didn't. He folded, shrinking behind his papers, hoping someone else would save the show. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood tall, unshaken, her hands relaxed at her sides. The calm in her was not new. It had been born years ago, in courtrooms where she'd watched guilty verdicts drop on innocent boys with no one there to speak their names. This moment, this collapse, it wasn't revenge, it was justice catching up. And Jasmine, patient and precise, had brought a clock. Then Candace finally spoke, but it wasn't defense, it was deflection. "This is being taken out of context," she muttered, voice thinner than anyone had ever heard it. "It's old. I've grown since then." But the words felt limp, unarmed. The power had drained out of them, like air from a slashed tire. She tried to straighten up, to find her footing, but every step she took inside that silence dragged louder than her words. Her eyes darted toward the moderator for backup. None came. She looked toward the audience. Cold stares, folded arms, the kind of stillness you only see at a funeral. Heron Jasmine stepped forward, not quickly, not triumphantly, just firmly, as if walking toward gravity itself. Her voice came again, this time even quieter than before, but it hit like thunder rolling through stone. "You say this is old. You say you've grown. But what kind of growth leads you here? Still defending lies, still monetizing denial. You didn't outgrow anything, Candace. You just got better at disguising it." There was no applause, no shouts, just the tension of collective realization settling over the room like a fog. Outside the building, news trucks scrambled for signal. Inside, the first tweets had already gone viral. Clips of the video, still frames of Owens mid-sentence. Headlines wrote themselves in real time. Candace Owens defends Hitler. Jasmine Crockett responds with silence that destroys. Influencers posted, pundits tweeted, political allies fell quiet. The world was shifting, and the epicenter was this room. Owens reached for her water, her hand trembling slightly. The tremor was minor, but the camera caught it, because cameras always catch what pride tries to hide. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply turned to the audience, then back to the lens, and said what no one else had dared. "If this is what leadership looks like in 2025, then God help us all, because silence isn't neutrality. It's complicity." And just like that, the collapse was complete. Not in a bang, but in the sound of power breaking. Beneath the weight of its own deception, it started with a blink, then a clip, a 10-second video ripped from the broadcast feed, uploaded by a college student sitting in the fifth row, captioned only with, "Did she really just say that?" Within minutes, it detonated across the internet like a grenade. Twitter lit up first, then YouTube. Then every major news outlet scrambled to catch the wave already cresting. Candace Owens, Hitler, nationalism, on tape, undeniable, unedited, and Jasmine Crockett, calm, unflinching, scorched into the center of the frame like a statue forged in lightning. By the time Owens had stepped off stage, the video had been viewed 1.2 million times. By the time she reached the parking garage, it had crossed 10 million. And by the time she opened her phone to dozens of missed calls, the hashtags had taken over every trending list in the country. Number O wins exposed. Crockett crushes. Truth is louder. What began as a confrontation was now a firestorm, a digital reckoning unfolding in real time. Commentators raced to dissect every frame. Audio engineers enhanced the clip. Body language experts weighed in. Lip readers, historians, Holocaust survivors, civil rights attorneys. Everyone had something to say, but the consensus was already cemented. Candace hadn't just stumbled. She had detonated a landmine and tried to walk away like nothing happened. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't even needed to raise her voice. Her silence had become the hammer. Newsrooms that once lined up to book Owens now released statements of disappointment. Fox News quietly pulled her from its weekend panel. Speaking engagements vanished overnight. Conservative influencers who once called her fearless now posted in frantic defense of their own distance. "I've always respected Candace, but this is unacceptable." Funders pulled donations. Brands pulled partnerships. Even her most loyal base fractured, some shocked, some enraged, others simply gone. Meanwhile, Crockett's inbox flooded with messages, not from publicists or producers, from mothers, teachers, veterans, survivors. People who had felt erased for decades now saw their story spoken aloud and seen it resonate louder than ever before. "You said what I couldn't. You gave us our voice back. We needed that silence more than words." Her phone didn't stop buzzing. Her team didn't sleep. But Jasmine remained steady, unmoved by the chaos, as if she had already known the storm was coming. And she had, because truth has a strange way of waiting. It's patient, it watches, it bides its time. And then, when the lie speaks a little too loudly, a little too arrogantly, it rises. Jasmine had built her life preparing for moments just like this. Not for fame, not for clicks, but for the simple act of defending reality in a world addicted to illusion. She watched the coverage not as a victor, but as a witness. This wasn't a triumph, it was a tragedy. Proof of how far America still had to go. That a woman could say what Owens had said and still be taken seriously. Until now. The storm wasn't just about one soundbite, it was about all the ones that had been ignored before it. All the quiet erasures, all the buried truths. That night, as the video crossed 50 million views, a new clip began to circulate. This one not from a phone, but from the network camera. A slow zoom on Jasmine Crockett's face right after the Hitler quote played. No reaction, no blink, just a stare. Unyielding, condemning, eternal. And with that stare came a caption that said it all. She didn't need to speak. The truth had already heard her. And across America, in homes filled with silence, something began to stir. The hallway outside the debate stage was eerily quiet. No reporters, no cameras, just echoes, the kind that cling to your skin long after the shouting stops. Jasmine Crockett walked alone, heels clicking against the cold tile, each step heavy with the weight of a truth finally spoken, and the backlash she knew would come next. Her staff had begged her to head straight for the car, but she needed a moment, not to breathe, not to recover, but to listen to the silence after the storm. She stepped into a maintenance stairwell and leaned against the cool concrete wall. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and that's what she needed now. Real, raw, unfiltered. She pulled out her phone, its screen still lit with thousands of notifications, but she didn't check them. She didn't need to. She already knew what the world was saying. They were calling her brave, fierce, heroic. But Jasmine knew the truth. Bravery doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like loneliness, like waiting for the knife in your back after you've told a truth no one else dared to say. Because for every person who praised her, there were others, shadowed, silent, watching with clenched jaws and bitter smiles. Men in high places who didn't like what she represented. Editors, donors, congressmen with power to bury bills in silence. They would say she'd gone too far, that she had made it personal, that her tone was too sharp, her stare too direct, her truth too heavy for morning headlines. But Jasmine had stopped trying to fit into their comfort zones long ago. She thought of the last time she'd felt this exposed. It was years ago when she'd defended a black mother falsely accused of assaulting a police officer during a wrongful eviction. The DA had painted her as unstable, aggressive, unhinged. But Jasmine had seen the body cam footage. She had watched as the officer slammed the mother to the ground, 5 seconds of brutality that the courtroom tried to forget. Jasmine had played the footage anyway. They told her it would ruin her career. Instead, it launched her calling. She had chosen then, and every day after, to be a mirror no matter how many people hated their reflection. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her younger brother. "I saw the clip. Mom would be proud. Dad too. You didn't blink." Jasmine smiled. Just slightly. Not because she needed affirmation, but because in that moment, she remembered what had built her. The nights her mother skipped dinner so she could study. The mornings her father gave her pep talks outside the school gates before facing a job that never gave him a promotion. She remembered the dinner table lectures about never letting the world define your worth. That was her real origin story. Not headlines, not cameras, but the fire born from being told you'll never be enough and daring to show up anyway. She finally stepped out of the stairwell and headed toward the parking garage. Her team was waiting, faces tight with concern, but Jasmine lifted a hand to stop their worry. She wasn't crumbling. She was crystallizing. Because in a world where denial was profitable and truth was punished, she had chosen to stand on the side that bled. Not for applause, but for accountability. Before she got in the car, she looked up at the sky. The clouds were splitting. A cold wind swept through the lot. And in that moment, she whispered under her breath, not a prayer, but a vow. Let them come. I didn't survive the silence just to surrender now. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Candace Owens had vanished. Not into the shadows, but into something colder, quieter, controlled. The kind of disappearance that wasn't about escape, but about damage control. Her team called it strategic silence, but America called it something else. Retreat. Just 24 hours ago, she had stood on stage beneath searing lights, her voice sharp, her confidence bulletproof. Now the stage was empty, the lights off, and the only thing filling the silence was the echo of her own words, looped endlessly across the internet, dissected by the hour, devoured by a public suddenly no longer on her side. Inside a gated estate miles from the city, blackout curtains sealed off every window. Her phone sat face down on the marble kitchen counter, vibrating with a frequency that felt like judgment. Candace sat hunched over in a leather armchair, no makeup, no script. Her laptop screen flooded with headlines that felt like knives. Candace Owens defends Hitler. Backlash erupts. Crockett's calm destroys Owens' career in seconds. From voice of the right to national scandal. She had weathered controversy before. She had been called worse. But this was different. This wasn't outrage from the usual suspects. This was coming from inside her own walls, her base. Conservative pundits who once sang her praises were now distancing themselves with surgical precision. One tweeted, "This isn't the movement I joined." Another posted a video titled, "I can't defend this anymore." Bookings were canceled. Sponsors went silent. One by one, the pillars she'd built her brand on crumbled like paper in a downpour. She tried to film a response. Just a short video. Her signature style, clean, poised, unflinching. But the words wouldn't land. Every line sounded hollow. Her voice, once a weapon, felt like a mirror now, reflecting her own undoing. She tried again, restarted, cut, deleted. In the footage, her eyes looked different, searching, uncertain, like a mask that no longer fit. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's image filled every major network, not as a loud voice, but as a measured one. Clips of her calm stare, her precise dismantling of Owens's rhetoric, her refusal to engage in theatrics. These were now the symbols of a reckoning. The media didn't frame her as a hero. They didn't need to. Her silence had said everything. And in contrast, Candace's noise now sounded desperate. She checked her email. Over 900 unread messages. A flood of backlash, resignation letters, media inquiries, and a final subject line that stood out like blood on snow. Fox has officially pulled the segment. She closed the laptop. Her husband walked in quietly, a hesitant question in his eyes. She didn't speak, just stared at the dark screen, at the empire she had built, one click at a time, one firestorm at a time, now reduced to ash and silence. And for the first time in years, Candace Owens was not in control of the narrative. She was drowning in it. Outside, the world kept spinning. Protest signs appeared on sidewalks. Former fans scrubbed her quotes from their timelines. And somewhere across the country, in a modest congressional office lined with legal books and worn leather chairs, Jasmine Crockett reviewed policy proposals and ignored every invitation to comment on the fallout. Because Crockett knew, the more Candace tried to hide, the louder her words would echo. And no press conference could unburn the truth once it had scorched its way into public consciousness. Candace stayed inside. Days passed, then a week. She waited for the storm to fade. But this wasn't a scandal built on speculation. It was built on her own voice. There was no one else to blame, no enemy to target, no headline to spin, just her and the mirror. And that was the most dangerous battlefield of all. Long before the podiums, before the debates, before the sharp suits and sharper words, there was a girl sitting cross-legged on a cracked linoleum floor, staring at her father's bloodied knuckles. Jasmine Crockett was only 9 years old the night she truly learned what power looked like in America, and who it belonged to. The air in their tiny Texas apartment was thick with sweat and silence. Outside, sirens still echoed in the distance. Inside, her father was slumped against the wall, clutching his hand with a dish towel soaked through with red. Jasmine hadn't seen what happened, but her mother had, and she said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the truth, when it hurt this much, became a kind of poison. Her father had been stopped walking home from work. Again, no reason given, no ticket issued. But this time, he had asked why. He had dared to question the authority of a man in uniform, and for that he had been slammed against a patrol car, wrists twisted, shoulder bruised. "He's lucky he didn't get shot," the officer muttered before driving off. Jasmine hadn't understood it then. Not fully, but she remembered the way her mother stitched her father's shirt by hand that night, fingers trembling, eyes never blinking. She remembered the way her father looked away from her when she asked, "Did you do something wrong?" And most of all, she remembered the answer he gave without words, a slow shake of the head, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of generations. That moment didn't break her. It branded her. The image of her father, proud, kind, broken by a system that saw his dignity as a threat, never left her. It followed her through school, through college, through law school. It sat beside her during every trial, every late-night reading depositions, every committee hearing where men tried to speak over her like her voice didn't carry weight. It whispered to her during her lowest points, don't forget who you are. Don't forget why you're here." Years later, when she first stepped into Congress, reporters asked her what inspired her to serve. She gave them the polished answer, a passion for justice, a desire to serve the people. But the truth was darker. What inspired her wasn't ambition, it was trauma. It was the memory of her father's eyes, unable to meet hers because this country had taught him that being a black man with pride was dangerous. And now, standing in the aftermath of the firestorm she had just ignited with Owens, Jasmine found herself alone in her office, staring at a faded photo taped to the inside of her drawer. Her father smiling, his hands clean, no blood, just hope. She reached out, touched the corner of the image, and whispered, "I saw it. I saw what they tried to erase, and I spoke." She remembered one more thing from that night, a sentence her mother had said as she tucked Jasmine into bed. Soft but firm. "One day, you'll understand why we survive quiet, but you, baby, you might be the one who gets to survive loud." And Jasmine had. Not out of arrogance, not out of vengeance, but because that little girl had made a vow, one that didn't care who was watching or who tried to stop her. She had promised never to let silence win, and tonight, after decades of waiting, she had kept that promise on a national stage. Because sometimes the revolution doesn't start with a scream, it starts with a memory, held like fire, carried until the day the world is finally forced to feel its heat. The debate was over, but the tremors were just beginning. By sunrise, it no longer belonged to the moderators or the networks. It belonged to the nation, split, breathless, and boiling beneath the surface. What had unfolded on that stage was more than a televised clash. It was a rupture, a wound sliced open in front of millions, refusing to clot. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, silent now, but louder than ever. Cable news played the highlights on an endless loop. Not the shouting, not the policy points, just that moment. The 2018 video, the silence that followed, the precision of Jasmine's stare, the line that echoed, "You didn't misspeak. You revealed yourself." It didn't matter where you stood politically, you felt it. It wasn't a debate tactic, it was a reckoning. Social media turned into a battlefield. On one side, the defenders, desperate to reframe the narrative, to downplay the Hitler remarks, to paint Jasmine as opportunistic or dramatic. On the other, millions of Americans who had lived in the margins for too long, now standing tall behind a woman who refused to let history be rewritten in real time. Hashtags became rallying cries. Threads unpacked generations of suppressed truths. Every clip, every syllable, was examined like forensic evidence in the trial of a national conscience. But the cost was real. For Jasmine, it came fast and sharp. Her staff warned her, donors were jittery. A few emails had already trickled in from high-ranking officials cloaked in concerned language. Congresswoman Crockett's tone was combative. The exchange may have reflected poorly on party unity. Translated, you embarrass the people who think they own your voice. And Jasmine knew what came next. It was never overt, never direct. It came as canceled meetings. Bills quietly delayed. Press that suddenly lost interest. This was how the machine protected itself, by reminding disruptors who really held the keys. But Jasmine didn't flinch. While Candace Owens withdrew, spinning behind closed doors, Jasmine went to work. She showed up early to her committee hearings. She spoke deliberately, backed every statement with data, and smiled at the reporters who kept asking for drama while she delivered policy. She wasn't performing, she was building, because the aftermath of truth isn't noise, it's construction. It's what you do when the flames burn down the lie and leave nothing but exposed ground. Still, the backlash found other ways in. Death threats trickled through anonymous inboxes, voicemails filled with venom. One message simply said, "You should have kept your mouth shut. You'll regret it." Her team begged her to take a break. She refused, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the fear had long since stopped mattering. She remembered something her law professor once told her. The first thing power will ask you is to apologize for making it uncomfortable. And Jasmine had just made an entire system choke on its own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, back in Owens's camp, the silence grew heavier. There were no live interviews, no rebuttal tweets, just a single press release, vague, defensive, and entirely devoid of apology. But the public wasn't waiting for spin. They had already moved on to the truth. The image of Jasmine, standing firm while the illusion collapsed beside her, had carved itself into the national memory. That night, Jasmine sat alone in her office, the lights dim, her window overlooking the Capitol. She stared at the dome, not with awe but with purpose, because this was never about a debate, it was about visibility, accountability, and the question that still echoed through the country: what happens when a lie meets a woman who refuses to sit down? The answer, it turned out, was history. It was never the applause Jasmine feared. It was what came after. The silence, the shifting eyes, the doors that once opened with a smile now cracking just slightly before closing again. The world loves truth when it's packaged in palatable tones, when it flatters the powerful and reassures the comfortable. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to reassure anyone. She had come to remind them that comfort and justice rarely share the same table. And now that the clapping had quieted, she could feel the machine turning. The morning after the viral explosion, Jasmine arrived at the Capitol alone. No entourage, no press fanfare, just her and the weight of what she'd just done. Elevators that once stopped for her didn't anymore. Staffers who once offered polite nods now looked down into their phones. A senior colleague brushed past her in the hallway with a forced cough and a muttered, "Tough night, huh?" It wasn't hostility, it was fear. The kind of fear that only surfaces when someone disrupts the illusion too forcefully, too publicly. In a closed-door budget hearing that afternoon, the tension was palpable. She asked a straightforward question about housing allocations in historically redlined districts and was met with blank stares and procedural dodges. The chair cleared his throat. "Let's stay focused, Congresswoman." Translation: "Don't bring that fire here." But Jasmine stared him down. "I am focused. Focused on the fact that we keep pretending the numbers aren't screaming." No one responded. She sat back, her hands steady, her spine unbent. This was the cost. This was always the cost. You tell the truth, they call it radical. You hold a mirror up, they call it divisive. The same people who cheered her from afar now walked by like her name was a rumor. But Jasmine didn't crumble. Because she wasn't built for applause, she was built for aftermath. Outside the building, the storm was still raging. Her staff showed her clips from town halls in Alabama, in Detroit, in Oakland, where people were quoting her words, where young girls held up signs that read, "She didn't blink." Veterans called her office in tears. Teachers sent in lesson plans. Civil rights icons reached out quietly, off the record. "You reminded them who we are," one message read. But inside the system, the walls were shifting. Requests for co-sponsorships suddenly went unanswered. A bill she'd spent 6 months drafting was mysteriously reassigned to review. Invitations dried up. She was being frozen. Not erased, but slowed. The old playbook, silence by suffocation. And yet Jasmine stayed the course, because she knew the applause was never meant to last. It was the fire that mattered, the thing that burned inside her even when the cameras went dark. She thought back to her father's lesson, told between sips of instant coffee one winter morning. Don't ever mistake a standing ovation for safety. If they clap for you too hard, make sure they're not just trying to drown out your voice. So she kept speaking, on the house floor, in community centers, on live streams run by kids in basements. Not because she wanted attention, but because the moment demanded continuity. A viral moment means nothing if it doesn't ripple outward. She wasn't interested in going viral. She was interested in going forward. And late one night, as she sat alone in her car outside a district office in East Dallas, Jasmine stared out at the city skyline and whispered what she always did when the world tried to push her back into silence. If they only clap when you're quiet, make sure you never are. The stage wasn't grand. It was a flatbed truck parked in a cracked church parking lot on the south side of Chicago. No spotlights, no teleprompters, just a sea of folding chairs, scratchy speakers, and a crowd that kept growing past the edges of the pavement. Jasmine Crockett stood behind the mic, not in a power suit, but in worn denim and a black coat that flapped like a flag in the icy wind. Behind her, a banner read, "Truth is not radical." In front of her, more than 6,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder, packed in like a heartbeat too big for one chest. The wind howled. Reporters flanked the perimeter. Drones hovered, but the crowd didn't move. They had come not for spectacle, but for something more sacred. Confirmation that they weren't crazy, that the truth they lived every day hadn't been erased, diluted, or denied. The rally hadn't been planned long, just 72 hours. But once Jasmine announced it, it spread like wildfire. Across TikTok, across Black Twitter, across every group text where people had grown tired of being gaslit by the nation they were still bleeding for. Jasmine stepped up to the mic and paused. The wind snapped. Phones rose. Silence thickened. Then she spoke, low, steady, every syllable like the click of a trigger. "They told me I should apologize for being too loud," she began, eyes sweeping the crowd. "They told me I should walk it back. They told me I'd cost myself everything if I stood on that stage and spoke what history dared not admit." Her voice rose, the wind rising with it. "But you don't apologize for surviving. You don't apologize for seeing." The crowd erupted, but Jasmine didn't pause for cheers. Her voice cut right through them. "They said Candace was misunderstood, that her words were taken out of context. Let me tell you something. If you need a translator to explain why you praised a genocidal dictator, you're not misunderstood. You're exposed." Roars followed, some fists raised, others holding signs scrawled with, "We are the context and history has eyes." But then Jasmine's tone changed. It softened, not in volume, but in weight. "This isn't about one woman. It never was. This is about a system that gives microphones to people who deny our pain while pulling plugs on the people who name it." Her hand tightened on the podium. "They say the past is behind us. But I ask, how far behind can it be when its fingerprints are still on our necks?" The crowd was silent again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was fire, slow, building, raging. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried farther than any shout. "We are not radical for wanting air, for wanting truth, for wanting to live without proving we deserve to. That's not revolution. That's reality. And it's about damn time the country started treating it that way." A ripple moved through the crowd like a current. Grandmothers wept. Teenagers stood taller. Activists gripped each other's shoulders. People who had been told all their lives to lower their voices now screamed from their souls. The truth didn't just echo, it roared. And Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of it, not as a savior, not as a politician, but as a witness, a fire starter, a survivor who refused to be quiet. Behind the rally, cameras kept rolling. Across America, millions watched, not from marble halls or gated neighborhoods, but from kitchen tables and shelter cots and back porches where hope had once flickered. Because in a country addicted to forgetting, this wasn't just a rally, it was a reminder. And this time, The truth had a microphone. The applause still echoed in Jasmine's ears as the rally dispersed. But in Washington, silence was the dominant sound. A different kind of silence, colder, more deliberate, the kind sharpened behind polished desks and bulletproof doors. Jasmine Crockett had ignited a national reckoning, but inside the halls of power, reckoning didn't translate to reward. It translated to resistance. And this time, it wasn't loud, it was surgical. The first cut came subtly. A committee reassignment, one she hadn't requested, one that moved her away from the Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights. The explanation? Strategic realignment. The next came harder. A bill she had co-authored, a modest housing initiative aimed at reversing decades of discriminatory zoning, was quietly shelved, buried. Aides wouldn't look her in the eye when they delivered the news. And then came the meetings, the ones that didn't happen. Invitations lost, phone calls unanswered, doors that had once opened with a handshake now closed before her heels hit the marble floor. This was the system protecting itself, not with smear campaigns or headlines, but with suffocation. Drown the fighter in red tape, starve her influence, let the fire run out of oxygen. Jasmine saw it all for what it was. She'd seen the same tactics used against whistleblowers, against prosecutors who asked too many questions, against journalists who dug 1 inch too deep. They didn't silence you. They erased your momentum, inch by inch, meeting by meeting, vote by vote. And still, she showed up. Because Jasmine didn't enter Congress to be liked. She entered to disrupt. And disruption came with casualties. Her staff dwindled. 2 aides left after receiving anonymous threats. Her family was targeted online. Her private emails were leaked. One headline read, "Crockett's Agenda. Too angry for progress?" A TV panel debated her tone, her hair, her stare, but never her facts, never the history she cited, never the truth she dragged from the shadows. She drove home in the dark more nights than she could count, watching streetlights blur through the windshield as exhaustion pressed heavy on her chest. One night, she found herself parked outside the courthouse where she had defended her very first client, a young man wrongly accused of resisting arrest. He had cried when the charges were dropped, not from relief but from disbelief. No one had ever fought for him before. That case hadn't made headlines. No cameras, no applause. But Jasmine had remembered that feeling, that trembling hope in someone's eyes, that moment where the system didn't win. That was why she kept going, because she wasn't just fighting politicians. She was fighting inertia, the kind that settles over institutions like dust, quiet, unshakable, deadly. The kind that tells you this is how it's always been and punishes anyone who dares to ask why. She wasn't naive. She knew she couldn't bulldoze centuries of oppression with a single speech or a viral moment, but she could chip away at it with every hearing, every policy, every refusal to stay silent. Jasmine once said, "I didn't run for office to make speeches. I ran to make noise where silence was profitable." And now that noise was costing her. But she paid it willingly. Because real change isn't just passed. It's bled for. It's built in the shadows, sustained in the quiet, defended when no one's watching. And when the systems push back, when they remind you who holds the pen, you keep writing anyway. In courtrooms, in committee rooms, in the streets. Because the truth is, the system never feared chaos. It feared clarity. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered it, sharpened like a blade. And now the system was bleeding. Buried in a stack of paperwork on Jasmine Crockett's desk was a bill that, to most, looked unremarkable. 13 pages, no flashy title, no buzzword slogans. Just small, surgical language aimed at dismantling something much bigger than anyone wanted to admit: generational disenfranchisement. Officially, it was called the Community Equity Stabilization Act, but Jasmine knew its real name, the one she whispered to herself on sleepless nights, the bill they're afraid of, because it didn't just demand change, it mapped it. It called for federal audits of housing discrimination patterns dating back 50 years. It demanded a national database for redline properties and financial restitution, not in theory, but in dollars. It required schools in historically defunded districts to be granted emergency status, triggering immediate infrastructure funding. And buried in Section 4 was the most explosive line of all. Any municipality found to have upheld racially biased zoning policies shall be subject to federal financial intervention. Jasmine had drafted every word by hand, not through consultants, through memory, through testimony, through voices from town halls where grandmothers cried over taxes they paid into systems that never paid them back, through court files where the ink still bled from rulings that left families homeless. This wasn't a gesture. It was a blueprint for structural rebellion, legal, permanent, undeniable, and Congress hated it. Behind closed doors, they called it too ambitious, too costly, too radical. One senator laughed out loud in a committee huddle. "You want to restructure the bones of American urban policy with a pen and a prayer?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She stared him down and said, "No, I want to use the pen. The people already gave me the prayer." The opposition came fast. Think tanks rushed to publish reports undermining the bill's feasibility. Media outlets ran headlines asking, "Is Crockett pushing too hard, too fast?" Lobbyists flooded inboxes, warning of economic instability. Translation, this bill would force them to pay what they owed. And that couldn't happen. Not without a war. But Jasmine didn't blink. She began working the floor like a lit fuse. Quiet meetings in back rooms with junior reps from marginalized districts. Late-night calls to civil rights organizations, urging them to mobilize their base. Testimonies from affected families were scheduled in 3 cities. Every appearance she made now began with the same line: "If a system can steal from you in silence, it must repay you in public." Yet every step forward came with a backlash. Her office received a bomb threat the day the bill was introduced. A staffer's car tires were slashed outside their apartment. An anonymous email leaked confidential details of her family's finances. But Jasmine kept going, because this wasn't about her comfort, it was about their lives, and she had already made peace with being the target, so long as the people stayed protected. One night she stood before the full house, the Capitol nearly empty, and read the bill's preamble aloud into the record. Her voice echoed through the chamber. "We cannot heal a nation by pretending it was never broken. This bill does not ask for charity. It demands correction." No applause followed, but the silence that came next, it wasn't indifference. It was fear, because deep down they knew this wasn't just a proposal. It was a fault line, and Jasmine Crockett was daring the nation to step on it. History doesn't remember silence. It remembers the moment someone dared to break it. It remembers the room going still after truth was spoken without apology. And long after the cameras are gone and the hashtags fade, what remains etched into the fabric of a nation is the sound of a voice that refused to be softened. Jasmine Crockett had not asked to become a symbol. She had not performed. She had endured. And in doing so, she had ignited something far more dangerous to the status quo than anger: conviction. They will say it began with a debate, that it started when one woman stood across from another and refused to dignify a lie with complicity. But that's not where the story truly begins. It begins with her father's silence after a beating he didn't deserve. It begins with a courtroom where a boy cried after being called thug by a system paid to protect him. It begins with a congresswoman reading names into the record, not because they would change a vote, but because they deserve to be heard. Jasmine Crockett's journey wasn't built on spectacle. It was built on scars. And it was those scars that made her fire untouchable. In the weeks that followed the fallout, the headlines began to shift. Candace Owens faded into the background, a cautionary tale in real time. Her empire built on denial had collapsed under the weight of a single unedited truth. No statement could unburn what was seen. No spin could rewrite what was said. But Jasmine? She didn't rise in opposition to Owens. She rose because history demanded a reckoning, and she simply refused to look away. When journalists asked what she thought history would say about her, she answered without blinking, "I don't care what history says about me. I care that it tells the truth about the people who've been erased. And maybe that's what history will remember most. Not just the fire, but the choice to carry it alone. Not the moment she struck back, but the years she carried the silence, waiting for the right time to break it. Not the viral video, but the cost that came after and her refusal to let it change her. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a lie. She exposed the system that fed it, and she did it knowing full well that the system would try to swallow her too. But history doesn't favor comfort, it favors courage. And when the time came, Jasmine Crockett answered not with a roar, but with resolve, unshaken, unbought, and unforgettable. The lights dimmed. The crowds faded. The headlines moved on. But the cost remained, not on paper, not in polls, in Jasmine Crockett's bones, in the way her phone rang less, in the way colleagues offered half smiles in the hallway, but never reached for her hand, in the way donors who once praised her passion now called her divisive. Truth, she had learned, doesn't come with a receipt. It comes with a ledger, and every word she spoke had been tallied. Behind every door she opened, there was another one shut. Her bill, the one they whispered might shake the foundation, was stalled in committee, not killed, just buried beneath procedural fog. The official excuse was lack of bipartisan traction. The real reason? It demanded too much honesty from too many people who made their careers avoiding it. She had pulled the curtain back, and no one wanted to see the machinery exposed. Security around her home increased. Threats came more frequently now, some typed, others handwritten. One note had arrived folded inside a children's book. It simply read, "You've made your point. Now disappear." Her staff begged her to travel with more guards. Her mother begged her to rest. But Jasmine never asked for safety. She asked for impact. And the truth was, impact never leaves you untouched. But she wasn't broken, just clearer, sharper. Every attempt to isolate her only deepened her conviction. They thought punishment would teach her to stay quiet. Instead, it reminded her why she couldn't. Because telling the truth in America wasn't just risky, it was revolutionary. And revolutions don't come cheap. Late one night, she stood in her office staring at the Capitol dome, lit like a crown she never asked to wear. A junior staffer entered quietly, unsure whether to speak. Jasmine turned and said with a calm, too steady to be shaken, "They want me to regret it." A pause. "But regret is for lies, and I've never been clearer in my life. Because the cost of telling the truth may be steep, but the cost of silence is a debt no soul can afford." Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium once more, not in a debate hall or a courtroom, but in front of the nation. The camera lights glared like interrogation lamps, the air heavy with expectation. This wasn't a press conference. It was a reckoning. No teleprompter, no filters. Just her, a microphone, and a country still unsure if it wanted to hear what it needed to know. "They warned me," she began, her voice low but piercing, "that telling the truth might make me a target. They were right. I've been called a radical, a liar, a disgrace. I've had doors slammed shut, security added to my home, and silence where support used to live. But I didn't come to Congress to be comfortable. I came because silence was killing us." She paused, letting the words cut through the quiet. "They want to make this about me and Candace. But this isn't personal. This is systemic. What I stood up for wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. And what scared them wasn't what I said. It's what they saw in themselves when I said it." A hush blanketed the crowd. No applause, no interruptions. Just listening, raw, unfiltered, necessary. "I will not back down. I will not water down the truth for anyone's comfort. Because the truth doesn't need to be polite. It needs to be heard. And if my voice shakes this building, then maybe it's because the foundation was never built on justice to begin with." She looked into the lens, eyes unwavering. "If history is listening, let it write this down. Silence was never an option. Not for me, and not anymore." Then she stepped back, and the screen faded to black. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.